Chapter 1 Rising Star 300,000 years ago, deep in a cave in what is now South Africa, a great mystery began. Something happened that marked the beginning of the human struggle with death, a struggle that has taken us on a long journey from magic to gods, to the strangeness and promise of Jesus, and more recently to a science of medicine that has at once prolonged life and, quite unexpectedly, opened a new door into the meaning of death. All those eons ago, that rough place teemed with animals, including pre-human creatures like the powerful, ground-dwelling Homo habilis, and a smaller, more delicate and vulnerable creature which has been named Homo naledi, man of the star. In the cave called Rising Star, there is a crevasse so narrow that only the slimmest person can slip through it. It leads down into a massive room that no four-legged animal could reach. But a two-legged creature, small and lithe and possessed of hands, could manage the tortuous journey. In September of 2013, two speleologists, Rick Hunter and Stephen Tucker, from South Africa's Speleological Exploration Club, working under the direction of paleoanthropologist Lee Rogers Berger, discovered, or rather rediscovered, this unobtrusive crevasse that through all the years that the cave had been known had been overlooked, but not by everybody, not 300,000 years ago. The only animal fossils in the chamber Hunter and Tucker found were the bones of a single owl. All of the other bones, hundreds of them, were from Homo naledi. It would seem that these ancient creatures, like us hominids, had been hiding their dead away in a place of safety. Whether or not there was any ritual involved, we will never know, but we can at once recognize the desire to cherish the bodies of our loved ones. Hundreds of thousands of years later, the Egyptians were still reverencing their dead, but a good deal more elaborately, preserving their bodies as mummies, which were intended to remain as focal points in this world for the souls of the departed. To this day, many Christians, obedient to the promise that one day the dead will rise, seek to preserve their loved ones in sealed coffins. If the Shroud of Turin did indeed wrap the body of Jesus, then this piece of linen, which would have counted as a fine one in Roman times, would have been intended to confer upon his body exactly the same sort of respect that started so long ago in the cave of the Rising Star. Homo naledi had a brain only a third the size of ours. If you looked at one of them, you would see a small ape, rather more fragile than a chimp. It had very human hands, though, and what you would not see is that the brain, though small, was built much like our own. Somewhere in that brain there appears to have existed the spark of self-knowledge that is the mark of the human, and with it the curse and the blessing that is our knowledge of death. From that day to this, we and death have been companions. At the Shanidar cave system in Kurdistan are found more recent remains from between 65,000 and 35,000 years ago that suggest that Neanderthals, more advanced members of our line than Homo naledi, cared for their injured and sick as well as their dead. There is a skeleton of a male who was badly injured but did not die of his wounds, and there are two cemeteries there that date from about 10,000 years ago and contain 35 individuals. Also 10,000 years ago, Homo sapiens had advanced into symbolic construction. This was when the enigmatic Göbekli Tepe site in Turkey was created, with its beautifully carved dolmens. Also the Sphinx at Giza, which will play such an enormous role in this story, may have been built at that time. All of this, over this vast journey of ages, reflects the same thing: self-awareness, and with it the emotions that cause us to miss our dead and mourn their passing. With awareness of death came the sense of desperation that to this day shadows us all, which has given rise to the central human question: is there anything left of us after death? Or is the richness of experience and mystery that is a human life doomed to simply disappear when we die? When civilization began, we believed that only the highest born of us might experience an afterlife. Then Jesus appeared, bearing the stunning message that not only was there a realm of heaven in which all were equal, but that there was a path within us that could enable anybody who truly embraced it to bring the peace of that kingdom into their heart right now, before death. The Jesus path is not a secret. It's laid out in the Beatitudes. But what has happened to the way we think about Jesus has caused it to be buried beneath an avalanche of confusion, misunderstanding, and finally, and for most people who live in the formerly Christian Western world, indifference. While an excess of Christian zeal destroyed the ancient polytheistic religion that had grown up around the Mediterranean basin, burned its books, pulled down its temples, and in doing so tragically diminished human knowledge, it also began the development of an extremely powerful idea, which is that every human being is equal before God and therefore has equal value. As violent as it was, the Christian Revolution gave us that. For too many of us, the promise of the Jesus teaching has slipped away, encrusted in religious doctrine, or dismissed because we find that doctrine impossible to accept. And yet the hope of some sort of deeper human validity is vividly alive in all of us, just as it was for Homo naledi or the builders of Göbekli Tepe or the apostles. No more than we, the people of the past, did not understand why death or any disease or disaster had to happen. They wanted to control their fate, but they had no means to do so. To fill the gap of ignorance, they imagined gods who had power over nature. They prayed to them and offered sacrifice. The rise of science has caused belief in all gods, including Jesus, to fade in importance. Around the world, our deities are becoming more and more either sentimental figures, there to allow us the comfort of worship, or too often social totems used to justify political violence. Presently, our world seems to be moving in many dangerous directions at the same time. It is hard to believe that we will not be facing more peril every day for years to come, and that Earth may eventually even become unlivable. As we shall see, this nearly happened to the ancient Romans, and what did happen to them destroyed them. Our earliest visions of how we understood our gods comes with the earliest written records that we can decipher, which appeared around 3500 BC. There are earlier ones, such as the Danube script, which dates from the 6th millennium BC, and the Easter Island script, but these have not been decoded. The very earliest written records basically are business transactions. But then, around 500 years later, texts such as the pyramid texts in the Pyramid of Unas in Egypt, and shortly after the Epic of Gilgamesh appear. We go from recording simple contracts, lists of kings and possessions, to creating works of great sophistication. Both are so highly developed that they suggest the existence of earlier texts that remain undiscovered. The pyramid text contains a subtly drawn vision of the soul and its journey, and the way experience gathered in life feeds or poisons the soul. In the text, the spine is seen as a serpent of light that collects the experience of life and transmits it to the soul. When the body dies, the weight of the soul is measured against a feather. The earliest known work of literature, appearing about 1,000 years after the Pyramid text, is the Epic of Gilgamesh. One of its sections is the first written account of the search for eternal life, which remains to this day a central human question, and is at the core of much religious doctrine. It is almost certainly why Homo naledi protected their dead. They wanted to believe that there was a reason to do this, just as hundreds of thousands of years later, the Egyptians would mummify their dead, and the Christian literature would promise that the dead will rise incorruptible and will be changed. 1 Corinthians 15:52. This desire for the survival of the dead emerges out of self-awareness, and another remarkable ancient document commits to the written word with poetic intensity and devastating effect our discovery of the self. When we discovered ourselves, we also discovered death and began to plead for deliverance. We pleaded to the gods we invented so that we could believe in our own prayers. But we were alone, and we are still alone, and each one of us faces death alone. Or do we? The first record of our discovery of self-awareness is the first 3 chapters of the book of Genesis. It may have been written as early as the 10th century BC, but most modern scholarship dates it to the 6th century. Its author is a matter of speculation, but its influence has been enormous. It can be said to be foundational to Jewish, Christian, and Islamic visions of what human beings are, and how human beings are connected to and relate to God. It records a creation story divided into an octave expressed as 7 days. On the 5th day, it describes the creation of animals and of man. God then gives man primacy over the whole creation, and at the beginning of Genesis 2, establishes us in a garden. That garden is the world as we knew it when we hunted and ate the fruits of the meadows. But the climate changed in the Middle East and became drier. Solar output changed. Earth's orbit did too. We explained it in the only way we could, as something that involved us. We decided that it was an act of God. But why were we being punished? What had we done to deserve this catastrophe? We had pleasure. That must be it. Our joy of life had angered a jealous God. But why? Where did our pleasure come from? Well, there was woman. And so comes a verse that has had one of the most negative effects on anything in sacred literature, or for that matter, all literature. It identifies woman as being created out of man and explains her as the source of our fundamental sin of self-discovery. It thus justifies a fundamental social imbalance that, as Judaic tradition expanded into the Judeo-Christian and Islamic cultures that presently dominate so much of the world, has tragically stifled the influence of half our species on the advance of thought and culture. Had women lived co-equally with men over these past millennia, it is not difficult to imagine that this might be a very different, more culturally rich and morally true world, not to mention a safer one. The early Christian heresy that has become known as Gnosticism taught that the God of Genesis was a dark presence and saw Eve's taking of the fruit of the tree of knowledge as an act of heroism. This contention was a response to Genesis 3, verse 22, "And the Lord God said, The man has now become like one of us, knowing good and evil. He must not be allowed to reach out his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat, and live forever." Now that a monotheistic interpretation of the Bible has become so ingrained in our thinking, it's easy to forget that the word us is used here. God is talking to somebody, but obviously it's not Adam and Eve. Gnosticism asserted that enlightenment or gnosis was needed to see past the illusions generated by this dark God and become one with the divine. As to who God was talking to, there has been much speculation, of course. The book of Daniel makes reference to watchers or messengers who are described as angelic servants of God. The apocryphal book of Enoch identifies them as watchers, some good and some evil. Genesis also establishes man as having sinned against God, having fallen, a vision of the self which continues to haunt Western culture to its very depths. Women, being the source of desire, were easy scapegoats for this supposed fall. If it hadn't been for Eve's tempting ways, Adam would never have been so foolish as to disobey the remarkably egotistical and neurotic God of the Old Testament. Because of Eve's supposed temptation, sexual pleasure became suspect, with tragic results that haunt us still in the form of the fear of women and sexuality that pervades Judeo-Christian and Islamic cultures. The belief that there is something wrong with sexuality and sexual pleasure has distorted billions of lives across 1,000 generations, leading to the persistent condition of gender inequality in the West and the catastrophic subjugation of women in the Islamic world. Genesis is also strikingly insightful, for by describing the verses about Adam and Eve and their expulsion from Eden as he did, the Genesis author inadvertently created the first written account of the discovery of self-awareness. The time of its writing obviously does not mark the moment when this happened, but rather the first time an insight into it was recorded. In Genesis 2, verse 25, Adam and Eve were both naked, and they felt no shame. In other words, they did not yet possess self-awareness. There is nothing to suggest that they were unintelligent, only innocent. Like animals, they lived without knowing what they were. As Genesis 3 begins, we find a serpent lurking in the tree. This serpent, as we shall see throughout this book, is a very ancient symbol. In the pyramid text, the spine is seen as a serpent of light. The author of Genesis was promoting a new god, El, who would later merge into Yahweh, then Jehovah, and now the omnipotent, formless God of the modern world. El was to be exclusive to the Hebrews, so the old ideas and the old powers had to be transformed into something evil in order to turn people away from them. Previous gods, in this case those who had been brought out of Egypt, had to be reconceived as demons. Thus what had been the light within us became the devil without. This process would happen again in a few thousand years, when the gods of the polytheists became the demons of the Christians. In Genesis, the now externalized source of knowledge ends up in a tree, which would, in the Egyptian religion, have been the body itself. The tree bears forbidden fruit, the knowledge of self. When you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. In other words, when you know yourself, you will understand the consequences of your own actions and create your own moral universe. You will replace God with your own inner self. In Genesis, this is what brings on the wrath of the deity, who banishes humanity into an inhospitable region where they must plead for help from God in order to survive. In the animal world, there is no good and evil. All animals are united in one thing. They behave only as they must, and in no other way. That behavior can be as simple as protozoans in a drop of water struggling to eat and be eaten, to chimpanzees setting out on murder patrols in the jungle. It is behavior, but innocent, as indeed in the days before we evolved a sense of self, our behavior was also without moral significance. As our societies grew more complex, we began identifying certain behaviors as evil so that social order could be preserved. The person who followed a path supportive of the social order could expect a reward after death. Thus, the 42 laws of Mat of the ancient Egyptians offered the promise of a path to heaven to anyone who upheld the social order. In the Papyrus of Ani, they are called negative confessions. The 10 Commandments, quite possibly compressed from them, are also, for the most part, negatives. And then come the Beatitudes, and suddenly there is a positive morality on offer. They are not about what we should not do in the world, but how the oppressed will be cared for by God. Because this necessarily suggests what we should do, that is to say, not be part of the oppression, it is a moral statement exponentially more subtle than the earlier ones. Far from being simple warnings, the Beatitudes require careful inner search to enact. You must observe yourself with love, compassion, and humility to find out how they fit into your life, but doing so rewards the determined explorer with an entirely new vision of one's own life, not to say the whole human moral universe. In Genesis, it is the realization that we are naked that triggers self-awareness. We might live naked as forest dwellers, but not in a larger social unit, not built as we are, unlike any other animal, hairless and bearing prominent, forward-facing genitals. We had to go clothed or overstress the fabric of society. It was Eve who saw that the fruit of the forbidden tree was good for gaining wisdom. Eve is a reversal of the Egyptian god Isis insofar as she has the exact opposite of the goddess's attributes. Isis is immortal while Eve is mortal. Isis possesses wisdom while Eve tries to steal it. It has to be this way, of course, as Adam cannot be the one to blame for stealing knowledge from God. So as Genesis 3 comes to its conclusion, we are made aware in no uncertain terms of what self-knowledge has brought us. For dust you are, and to dust you will return. Genesis 3, verse 19. The timeless world of our innocence is at an end. The earliest written record concerning human self-awareness that we have thus contains a group of flaws that have worked ever since to distort that very awareness. But why is it like that? Why is our discovery of ourselves distorted like this? After all, the story could have been a joyous one, a God expressing delight that the pinnacle of his creation can know him. Instead, the God of Genesis is so angry at our evolutionary success that he drives us into a desert where we end up scratching for a living and fighting among ourselves like rats in a maze. Thus begins the relationship with deity that has been with us ever since. Supplied with everything, we don't need gods. Supplied with nothing and not understanding why, we are going to invent them. There were numerous climactic upheavals beginning 12,000 years ago when the last ice age ended. It's possible that the worldwide legends of great floods reflect the sudden melting of the glaciers, and that a story of a people living in a garden of plenty that became a desert memorializes one or more of the abrupt climate upheavals that took place between 12,000 BC and 5,000 BC. As the authors of Genesis had no understanding of nature, they assumed that a power greater than any they could control must be responsible for the natural disasters. There could only be one such power, God. From time immemorial, nature's power has been personalized as the action of gods. All religion, in one way or another, is based on controlling gods with sacrifice and prayer. All religion, that is, until the time of Jesus, who spoke not just in terms of satisfying God, but also of entering into a companionship. Sacrificing to gods has nothing to do with controlling nature, and therefore must often fail. When it does, a sense of guilt is generated. When you sacrifice a valuable animal and the rain doesn't stop, you naturally feel that you have not satisfied your God. You up the ante, perhaps sacrificing a child. When things get worse and worse, no matter what you do, you are eventually going to conclude that there is something fundamentally wrong with you, and before you know it, Your society has institutionalized an idea like original sin. In our case, this unfortunate mistake has deprived generation after generation of the chance to fully embrace the joy of being alive and being human. As the Ice Age ended, climate upheavals caused mass extinctions and diebacks. In areas such as the Middle East, humans had to abandon hunting and gathering and start growing food for themselves. That this was hard for us is revealed by the difference between the bones of hunter-gatherers and those of early farmers. The farmers are smaller and show signs of diseases like rickets and arthritis that are not seen in the hunter-gatherer fossils. The human journey has come to another turning point that is very similar to the one that we experienced when the Ice Age ended. Just as the people of those distant times had to either starve or figure out how to farm, we are going to have to figure out how to cope with the extinction event that is unfolding now, or suffer the consequences. But what can this have to do with a teacher from a distant time whose short career ended in the ignominious death on a cross? What he left behind is an idea of who we are that we have never really understood or perhaps been able to face. Time has run out. If we are to survive, we must read his real message and we must understand. Its value is attested by the strangest and most hopeful thing about his life, the one thing that suggests that there may actually be something on offer to mankind from a higher entity that, for want of a better word, we might as well call God. It is the extraordinary